No one is destined to develop a substance use problem, right? You're not born destined to develop a problem. But what we know is that the other thing that then accumulates in that jar to make it full, potentially to lead to problems, is, the so-called environmental rocks that we're putting in. Some of those might be a big rock, right? A big trauma. Some of them might be lots of little rocks, stressors and accumulation of challenging life circumstances. And so you can imagine how you might have a low genetic predisposition, but if you accumulate a lot of environmental stressors, that could lead to problems.
Welcome to the Sober Spill podcast. I'm your host, Isabel. On this podcast, we have real conversations with people in recovery, their families, and organizations that pertain to this field. Today, I'm here with the host of the clinical side of our podcast, Jana Wu.
Thank you, Isabel. My guests will discuss best clinical practices, new emerging trends in substance use and mental health disorders, and how we can best take care of ourselves and our loved ones in recovery.
See you every Thursday.
And come spill with us soon. Hi, welcome to the Sober Spill. I'm Jana Wu, and today we are extremely excited to be speaking with Dr. Danielle Dick. She has been working for over 20 years at the intersection of psychology and genetics. She studies the way our genes and our environments influence our lives. Dr. Dick is also the director of the Rutgers Addiction Research Center Brain Health Institute. The Rutgers Addiction Research Center brings together researchers from across the Rutgers campuses and medical centers who are working to tackle addictive disorders. Dr. Dick's research at Rutgers spans basic science, prevention and intervention, treatment and recovery, and public policy. It addresses substance use disorders, gambling, social media and gaming, eating disorders, and more. They work to bring that research into the community in engaging and empowering ways and to help others apply this knowledge in ways that will benefit their lives. Dr. Danielle Dick is also the author of The Child Code, Understanding Your Child's Unique Nature for Happier and More Effective Parenting. This book explains how each child is uniquely coded with predispositions that influence everything from their fearfulness to impulsivity. This is a provocative, science-based book that helps parents approach and understand how each of their children are wired to take off the pressure and learn what strategies actually work best. What an incredible profile. Thank you so much, Dr. Dick, for joining us today on the Sober Spill.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I would love to maybe just sort of jump right into two things. One, how did you get here to write this book? And also be a person that is running, the largest comprehensive research center in the country for addictions at Rutgers University. How did these two coincide and how did you get here?
So I'll start with what led me to write the book, and then I can talk more broadly about what took me into this field. When I had my son, I, oh, the irony, found myself raising the high-risk child that I study, highly impulsive, highly emotional. And for me, knowing the research was really what saved my sanity. And I looked around, and for the first time, I was paying attention to what was out there kind of in the popular press and the media that's accessible to parents, because there's so much information out there now. There's parenting books and blogs and podcasts and all the things. But one of the things that really struck me was that no one was talking about the role of genetic influences on kids' behavior. And I think that's because as a parent, you're in the trenches and you're trying to figure out, how do I navigate this temper tantrum or, this other kind of challenging thing that I'm dealing with my child. And it seems like, well, genetics, I can't do anything about genetics. Why would I care about that? But I really think that's a major mistake because, one, it causes us, when our kids are not being the perfectly well-behaved, dreamy kids we all imagined we would have before we had any of our own children, it causes us to think, what am I doing wrong? And I looked around and I saw so many of my amazing parent friends whose kids were having any kind of challenges, or if they were having challenges as a parent, thinking, what am I doing wrong? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with my child? And, I think the second part is that, candidly, if we're all honest, we have a tendency sometimes to be a little bit judgmental of other people's parenting. We look at what we're doing, what worked with our kids, and we look at, the kid throwing a fit at Target and what that parent is doing, and we think, oh, that parent really needs to, insert your favorite parenting advice. And and I think that by recognizing that actually every one of our kids is wired differently, they literally have brains that formed differently based on their unique genetic codes. And so by really paying attention to that and thinking about what that means for your unique little kiddo, each one of them, and their development, and importantly, what parenting will work best for kids who are wired in different ways, because kids all need different things based on their own unique kind of makeup and brain wiring. And I just didn't see that out there. And so that's what really led me to write this book in a very user-friendly, me as a parent talking to other parents, but trying to get the research out to folks who could use it.
I really appreciate that. And I think you nailed that of getting the research out where it's very well informed, but it's very accessible as a parent. I could visualize so many of the different scenarios having been there myself, and being very extroverted myself with maybe not extroverted children. Um, I am curious though, again, coming back to the families we work with and see often at Mountainside, that we know, and so often the parents ask, did they have a predisposition towards addiction, and what could I have done differently? I knew my parent, I knew we had alcoholism in our family. What could I have done differently? Or is there a reason why this happened to my child? Why, what could I have done differently? How do you think the genetics interplay with addiction?
So we know that virtually every behavior that has been studied, from normal behavioral variation, right? Differences in impulsivity or fearfulness or worry, to clinical disorders like substance use disorders or depression or anxiety. Virtually every behavior that's been studied has some degree of genetic influence. And on average, we say the differences between people for most outcomes and substance use and other forms of addiction tend to be in this realm is about 50% genetically influenced. So, meaning 50% of the differences between people and their likelihood of how much they like substances, how likely they are to keep using them, to use them in heavy ways, to develop problems. About half of the differences between people is due to differences in their DNA, the luck of the draw when it came to the genes they were born with, and about half is due to differences in the environment. And what that means for any one individual is not that if, for example, I develop a substance use problem, that it's half in my genes and
Mhm.
half in my environment. The way we help people understand it is we talk about we all have a mental health jar. So imagine like a clear one of those glass mason jars.
Mhm.
And when that jar is full, that's when someone is actively experiencing a substance use disorder, for example. Now, what are the things that can make that jar full that can lead to experiencing problems? Well, the first thing is we're going to put marbles in that jar and they represent a person's genetic predisposition. So, how many genes do they have that increase risk? And that is distributed like a bell curve in the population. So some people get lucky and they start life with jars with just a few little marbles at the bottom. Lots of us have jars with kind of a handful of marbles. And some people get unlucky and they might start with jars that are 3/4 of the way full already. Now, no one is destined to develop a substance use
Mhm.
problem, right? You're not born destined to develop a problem. But what we know is that the other thing that then accumulates in that jar to make it full, potentially to lead to problems, is, the so-called environmental rocks that we're putting in.
Mhm.
Some of those might be a big rock, right? A big trauma. Some of them might be lots of little rocks, stressors and accumulation of challenging life circumstances. And so you can imagine how you might have a low genetic predisposition, but if you accumulate a lot of environmental stressors, that could lead to problems. Other people who, for example, have families where maybe there's a lot of problems running in the family, you might know that, okay, they might be more likely to have started with a strong genetic predisposition, and then it didn't take as many things to lead to their jar being full and they're developing a substance use problem. And so I give that analogy so that hopefully people understand we're all our own unique combination of our genetic and environmental risk. Genes definitely play a role. They don't make anyone develop problems. They don't destine anyone to have problems. So that means there's things that we can do on the treatment side or on the prevention side to essentially reduce the likelihood that someone's jar will get full, essentially, that they'll be actively experiencing problems. We can try and make that jar taller, right? We can put extra rings of resilience. So it takes
Mhm.
more to develop problems for it to be full. Or we can try and remove some of those environmental rocks. So regardless of a genetic predisposition, there are still things that we can do, as you all know from the wonderful work you're doing there at Mountainside.
Thank you so much for that. That is really powerful that no one is destined. Though we might have the DNA and the genetic makeup, that we can put in some protective factors of resilience. That is huge, I think, for a lot of people because often too, when we have clients that we're working with, they come into recovery and one of their biggest fears is that will I pass this down to my family? Will I pass this down to my children? How do you think clinicians can best help clients understand that relationship between the environmental factors and that this isn't destiny, but recognizing the factors they could perhaps pass on?
So, one of the things that I think is really important is that we have learned a lot about what those genetic risk factors are, how they operate. And so, one of the things that we have learned over the last decade or so is, I often describe it as kind of three big genetically influenced pathways. These are three big ways that our genes influence risk for developing problems with addiction. One of them is drug specific. It's the way that bodies respond to
Mhm.
drugs. And I think this is what people commonly think about when they think about genetic predispositions toward a substance use disorder. They think some people, when they use a particular drug, be it alcohol or opioids or cocaine, whatever that might be, that they are much more likely to become physiologically dependent, addicted to that drug. There is a little bit of truth to that. There are genes that influence the way that we respond to drugs. So, how we metabolize them, whether it makes us sick, whether it makes us feel really good. People vary in their response to drugs, and obviously that plays a role. So, for example, if you carry certain genes that make it very difficult to break down a toxic byproduct of ethanol,
Mhm.
acetaldehyde in the body,
Yep.
it causes facial flushing, it causes
Mhm.
nausea. It's really hard to
Mhm.
develop an alcohol problem when every time you take small sips of alcohol, it makes you very sick. That's a protective genetic factor, right? But those are kind of the rare exceptions. So, genes, yes, they play a role in how we respond to drugs. But actually, the far more important ways that our genes influence risk for addiction have nothing to do with the way bodies respond to drugs. They are about the way our brains are wired. And so what we know is that one of the biggest risk pathways is that our genes influence the way that our brains process risks and rewards. And this shows up in little kids and impulsivity, right? They like trying new things. They're pushing the edge of the envelope. These are kids whose brains love novelty. They like reward. They like sensation seeking, right? We
Mhm.
see this in adults too. There's the new documentary about the gentleman who just climbed the side of the building and, free soloed up the side of a mountain before. And like these are people who like that rush feeling. Their brains discount the risks. The reward is so salient that the risks seem much further and they kind of diminish in importance. The reason I go into this is because risk taking, reward seeking brains that are wired toward this this is not necessarily a bad thing. It means that kids are at elevated risk of behavior problems when they're,
Mhm.
they might either have a greater likelihood of having ADHD. They're all over the place. They're wanting to do and try lots of different things, can make it harder in school settings. They're more likely to have behavior problems as adolescents because they like pushing the edge of the envelope. They like breaking the rules, the little bit of rush that comes with those kind of normal developmental things. It also puts one at elevated risk for substance use problems
Mhm.
when substances come online, and substances provide powerful rewarding effects on the brain. And then, of course, they can literally change the brain from there so that everything else that's usually rewarding really diminishes in
Yep.
value. But that's not necessarily a bad thing in the sense that risk taking, reward seeking CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots
Mhm.
are all higher on that. So I go into this because the idea of, am I going to pass this down to my children? Yes, if you have alcohol problems or other substance use problems in your family, it increases the likelihood that you are carrying more of those risk enhancing genes and that you will pass more of those down to a child. But this doesn't necessarily have to result in substance use problems. And by understanding what genetic risk looks like and how it shows up earlier in development, returning kind of to my book and why I wrote this book about kids, you can help kids understand potential pitfalls and things they might be at risk for and put in place kind of systems to reduce the likelihood of that and to accentuate those natural tendencies and the strengths that come with them. Because there is good and not so good associated with all of our genetic tendencies.
That is so interesting. It does make me think a lot of the examples in the book. It just really struck me as all those little day-to-day examples, basically, of ways that we can acknowledge sort of the what's there, um, but also without hopefully pathologizing or trying to make a child into someone that they might not be, while staying open-minded at the same time of all the potential they have.
Absolutely. And that can be a hard thing for all of us as parents. But I do think that the recognition that each of our kids is wired differently and they are not, the so called lumps of clay that are just waiting to be molded into the people we imagine them to be. They come with their own dispositions, their own wiring, and that by recognizing that and recognizing that when they're children, then in fact, we do have the opportunity to both put in place kind of some of these safeguards and things to promote resilience and reduce potential problems, but also, really, as you were saying, to help kids recognize some of these things which otherwise might start to feel like liabilities, like,
Mhm.
oh, like my parents don't like the way I am, or I shouldn't be this way. So, for example, we talked about the impulsivity piece being one of the things that we know can elevate risk. It can also be very challenging for parents.
Yes.
Having kids with ADHD, my son did, it's hard. And our tendency sometimes can be, "Stop doing that. Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
sit down. You're always on the move. You're getting in trouble at school." And what happens is they start getting all this negative feedback from parents, negative feedback from teachers. And, we know that's not good for kids. Now you imagine they internalize this, they get a little older, maybe they try substances. It makes some of those feelings go away. And that's how one can get into these unhealthy patterns. The third risk pathway that I didn't talk about before is related to the way our brains process worry and fear. And
Mhm.
this shows up in things clinically like anxiety or depression. And we know that, again, like impulsivity, it's distributed like a bell curve. Some people are very high, some people are very low, lots of folks are in the middle. But if you think for a minute about a child who is more anxious or fearful, those are things that we know there are skills and strategies that you can, start at any age, but is especially, important if you can start when kids are young to help teaching them how to manage that anxiety, how not to fall into those cycles of ruminating or becoming so anxious that it's starting to impact their life. How do they manage those feelings? When you put that in place early, it can reduce the likelihood that as they get older, they start to use substances to self medicate. But going back to that's a positive thing a parent can do when they understand kind of what's going on and can support their child. You can also see how a well intended parent might be like, oh my gosh, get over it, right? Like you need to go to school. Why are you refusing to go to school, right? What is wrong? Why are you hiding? Why don't you go out and play with the neighborhood kids? Like, come on. That is, the equivalent, I sometimes say, of a child who is not able to do well in algebra. You're saying, like, "Oh my gosh, do algebra,"
Yeah.
or "Go sit in a timeout until you can pass this algebra test." They don't have the skills. We actually need to give them the skills. We need to teach them how to do algebra, not think that, like, our chastising them is going to give them that ability to pass the algebra test. But when it comes to behavior, we very often think like, "Oh my gosh, why can't they just do it?"
Yep. Or
And
why can't they just stop? I mean, I think we hear a lot.
exactly.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the little ways. And part of the reason I read the book is because when we're cognizant of this as parents, when we intentionally think about each of our kids, how they're wired, what their natural tendencies are, as you know, there's surveys and things in the book to help you
Mhm.
understand where your child falls on some of these big important dimensions. Then what we can do is it can help us start to think about how do we put in place some of these strategies to support them and kind of becoming the best version of themselves and avoiding some of these things, like substance use, risky problems, etc., that we know can follow when kids are experiencing challenges.
I'm Ricky, recovery support clinician here at Mountainside. We offer a healthcare professionals program for physicians, nurses, dentists, and therapists. Our team of board-certified addiction specialists provide discreet, comprehensive treatment for substance use and co-occurring disorders. We're here to help you achieve sustainable recovery with a plan built around your unique needs. Reach out to admissions at mountainside.com for more details.
What would you say to like either an adolescent parent or an adult that has a child that, adult child that's struggling that feels like I totally missed the boat. I misread my child that they had ADD and I felt like I could not tolerate it or I didn't have time. I didn't have the resources or the knowledge that I do now. How can I deal with this now with a 26-year-old or 30-year-old child or a teen?
Yes. One of the things that I think a lot about is, and I talk to parents of all ages about is it's never too late. It's always a good idea to have these conversations earlier rather than later, but there is never too late a time to have them. Of course, the reality is that when someone is older, there is more of a history and there might be more repair that needs to be made, right? And it's going to take more time to essentially change that relationship that you might have with that person. And we all know that. That's just a reality. But if you are in a position with, say, a late teen or an adult, and you now learn something new and you start thinking about addiction in a different way, or what led to it, or what caused it, or how you might relate to that individual in a new way. Obviously, that's going to take some time to have those conversations, to repair those relationships, to establish new patterns with that person. It's hard to do for any of us. But the other thing is that none of us is perfect. All of us make mistakes in our parenting and in our relationships. It doesn't matter how many PhDs or, counseling sessions you have done or you have, all of us could strive to do better. And so owning up to that too is a great thing to do. Meaning, I would say to my son, and I still do, you know what? I messed that up yesterday when we had that conversation. I was really frustrated and I took it out on you. And I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. And I'd like to try again. And, can we talk about it? And I am now in a place where I've got control of my emotions. And so we can have a better conversation about it. Those are kind of some of the ways that you can think about how do we start to change the nature of the relationships, regardless of what has transpired in the past.
Danielle, thank you so much. I really appreciate that perspective that it's not too late. In our family program, we work with a lot of siblings that their siblings addiction has been very hard on them. They don't struggle with a substance, but they have been on the front lines and they have very different dispositions. And it sometimes is that question of how can we be so different? We came from the same family, we had the same environment growing up, we have the same genetics. How did we get here?
So in my field, there's a running joke that everyone is an environmentalist until they have their second child. And then you realize I'm doing all of the same things. How come this one is turning out so differently? And that is a product of the fact that, the quick genetics lesson is, of course, that you get 50% of your genetic material from biological mom and 50% from biological dad. So if you imagine the, literally tens of thousands of places in our genome where we have differences, then, it's like reaching in and grabbing out half of the marbles from each bag the first time, and then reaching in and grabbing out half of the marbles from each bag again the second time. And so kids and full siblings, while they share 50% of their DNA, because they're getting the same makeup from the biological parents, they're working from the same sets of genetic variants, but they can get very different ones. And, that's how you can end up with two tall parents who have a shorter child because by chance, if just the small number of height decreasing, if you will, let's call them short genes for shorthand. If you get the small number of short genes, that even tall parents are likely to have a few of those, and the child inherits all of them, it's not likely that you're going to flip a coin and get 10 heads in a row, but it's possible. And so this is why sometimes when it comes to parents and kids or siblings, you can look and go, why is this person so different, right? Different
Mhm.
from me, or different from my spouse, or different from both of us, or different from their sibling. And it's, that's one of the things that makes us all so amazing as a human race, is that we all have our own unique genetic codes, and we can look around and see how different people are on the outside, right? All that amazing diversity that exists, and just even how you see how people look. But we're just as different on the inside, in terms of, even though we mostly have all the same organs and we have a brain and, it's largely got the same parts and whatnot, those details of how things are wired actually make our brains function really differently. And it's kind of a default to just assume other people's brains work the
Mhm.
way that ours does. I mean, that's why so often we can look at our spouse or whatnot and be like, no, that wasn't at all what I said. Or what were you thinking? Or, I mean, that's another fully formed adult brain. And it's
Mhm.
like, we're just seeing the world in different ways sometimes. And, you have it with your family members and with your friends. And I think one of the things that we can do by thinking intentionally about genetics and our dispositions is get in front of that a little bit, is
Mm.
both recognize and accept that it's different. And that's actually why we see the world in different ways. We see each other's behavior in different ways. We even see this with two parents can interpret the same behavior they're seeing in a child in different ways, right? One person might think this child is so impulsive and it's really creating problems. And the other parent might think, oh, you're so uptight. Like it's
Mhm.
not a big deal. They're full of energy, right?
Mhm.
So, so you're right. In the book, I even talk about how to navigate these differences between parents and kids, between partners, etc., because all of our brains work a little bit differently.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing this. And I did want to ask too about, how this is so interesting and how this informs your work at Rutgers. And if you could share a bit about your position at Rutgers, how you came to be there. It is the largest comprehensive research center in the country for addictions, which is really exciting. It's a very diverse community. So I'd love to hear about some of your experience there, coming from this incredible research background.
Absolutely. So, the book was my effort to get research out to parents. And one of the things I am really passionate about is how we can actually use research to improve lives. But I am fortunate to be at Rutgers now, where I'm leading the largest addiction research center in the world. As you noted,
It's
we have more
amazing.
than 125 researchers who span everything from basic science, so who study genetics, neuroscience, all the way to through faculty who are studying epidemiology, etiology, what causes things, what are risk factors, what are protective factors, how does that unfold across development, using that to develop new prevention and intervention programs. And then we have other faculty that are working on treatments, on developing new treatments, whether pharmaceutical, behavioral, kind of novel and cutting edge treatments like
Mm.
transcranial magnetic stimulation, through to supporting recovery and figuring out how do we build the best policies to support positive outcomes. So we have faculty that really work kind of across this translational spectrum. And so one of the really exciting things is that by having this wealth of expertise, we can really hopefully advance discovery, make a difference in our ability to prevent and treat substance use disorders and to support recovery. And then what we're really focused on right now is how can we better get research advances out of our laboratories, out of scientific journals to the people who can benefit from them. And so these kinds of partnerships are one of the ways that we're working to create those bridges.
It's incredible. And how did you come to work in substance use disorder treatment and recovery?
So I was pre-med back when I was an undergrad at the University of Virginia many years ago. And I took a class on clinical psychology. And I really became fascinated by the brain as the last frontier of medicine.
Mm.
There is so much that we don't know. These are incredibly prevalent conditions. And so, we talk about 1 in 4 adults will be affected by a substance use or a mental health challenge at some point in their lives. Some estimates are as much as, 50% of people, depending on what kinds of things you include in that. But regardless of those actual numbers, we all know just from our own lives that substance use and mental health challenges affect every one of us, whether it's personally, whether it's in our families, in our friends, in our communities, in our coworkers, and our other loved ones. So I was just blown away by how prevalent these conditions are, how much they impact all of us,
Hmm.
and yet how little we know. And I worked on a psychiatric unit, and I really was disheartened by, what we still see a lot today, the revolving door of people who come, they get well, and
Hmm.
then they're back again. And that really led me to think I'm interested in trying to better understand what causes these conditions so that we can use that discovery, we can use new findings to do better. And that's really what drives me. I went to grad school. I was working originally in schizophrenia, a more severe mental illness characterized by hallucinations and delusions. And I went to grad school thinking I might continue to work in that area. And I ended up working on a project studying the development of alcohol problems. And I really became fascinated by how they touch so many people. They embrace and, all the complexity that exists in medicine, that there's biological components, there's genetic components, the environment plays a role, all kinds of environments play a role, everything from our families to our communities to the way policy can affect things. And my mom would have said since I was little, I love a good challenge, right? And so
Sense that.
essentially trying to figure this out and to really advance the research in ways that can make a difference, because I saw this is a real area that could use that. That's really what drives me and what keeps me going and focused as a center director as well.
That is really, really interesting. And I wonder too, how, if you could speak, and you are speaking directly to clinical providers too, how we can on the front lines or in treatment sort of implement some of the research. I love that mission too of taking the research from the labs into people's hands and into people's practices. What would you say that clinicians could do a little better or could focus on now?
So we talked some about how I really think what we've learned about genetics and how that the different ways that genes play a role in the development of substance use problems can be useful, in terms of understanding loved ones, talking with them or whatnot. But I also think it's very interesting and important from a clinical perspective because, for example, knowing that most of the predisposition is broad. So, meaning it is not substance specific. So, it is not like an individual is carrying genes that elevate risk for alcohol problems, as distinct from the genes that elevate risk for other drug problems, as distinct from, for example, genes that elevate risk for gambling problems or gaming, addiction or other kinds of things. The fact that we have learned that a lot of this predisposition is related to the way brains are wired to process rewards and to
Hmm.
discount risks, it means that, for example, from a clinical perspective, when you're thinking and working with someone and you're putting in place plans for recovery, that if that individual carries sort of those characteristics and that disposition, which you can, both know through having conversations and getting to know your patients. I also have freely available on my website, danielledick.com. There's the substance use risk profiles. It's a survey you can download to kind of, look at where an individual falls on some of these different risk dimensions. You can use that as a tool. But if an individual, say, is carrying this kind of predisposition, then when you're putting in place a recovery plan, you want to think about how do you holistically support that person's recovery. It's not just about removal of, say, that substance of choice.
Yep.
It's about helping them understand that you want to think about how are we going to channel this in ways that are going to be positive and support your health outcomes and goals, and not accidentally find yourself in things like, oh, now I'm spending all of my time in online gaming or gambling or other kinds of unhealthy outlets that this could get channeled into, if you will. So that's one of the ways that I think understanding something about an individual's risk profiles can be useful to clinicians now. And so I have information about that that's kind of intended to be user friendly and freely available on my website. The other ways that I think new research advances really have the potential to change clinical practice will be in what I see as some of these new and exciting developments coming down the pipeline. These are not things that are widely used, approved, often funded by insurance or things yet, but for which there's very promising preliminary evidence. And so we're now working and want to partner with different clinicians and whatnot to essentially implement and study and how can we refine and develop what I think of some of the next generation of treatment tools. And so, for example, cranial magnetic
Hmm.
stimulation. It's literally, you can use magnets to change the electrical activity of the brain. And so we know that drugs literally then kind of change that brain wiring. And that's one of the reasons that essentially, recovery can be so challenging both to get to and to maintain, because your brain has changed, and it's so rewards, or drugs provide such a consistent reward and powerful, that many of the other things that you're trying to essentially, replace that with naturally rewarding things like spending time with your kids and with your spouse and with your friends and loved ones. I mean, I love my spouse to death, but he is not 100% rewarding in every
Mhm.
single one of our interactions,
Yeah.
right? That's true of the reality of many of the things that are rewarding in life. They're not as potent as a drug, which every
Mhm.
time can produce a really rewarding effect. So that's the brain has become rewired to expect that. And with some of these new techniques, we literally can image an individual's brain, look at where in their brain specific targeted areas that are related to this reward processing are located, position these magnets so that we can change the electrical activity and start literally rewiring that brain, essentially returning those processes that have become abnormal with the use of heavy drugs to a place where they are now looking more like a quote unquote, I hate this word, but what we would see is a more normal reward
Mhm.
processing brain. So those are some of the things we're really excited about. In my own area of genetics, we now have the ability to create genetic risk scores for an individual where we have identified thousands of locations in the genome, none of which is a gene for addiction or for a substance use disorder. All of them have little effects that come together to
Mhm.
impact the way brains are wired, the way bodies respond to drugs. And so what we can do now is easily, like with a cheek swab, right? We can collect DNA, we can sequence the genome, and we can essentially add up for any individual all these thousands of locations and weight each one by how big of an effect it has to create a risk score for someone. It's not determinative, right? But we also know a lot about what are the early behaviors and environments that are related to the development of problems. And so we have built a platform called CARES, the Comprehensive Addiction Risk Evaluation System, that puts all this information together, specific genetic risk, behavioral and environmental risk, so that individuals can help get a picture of their overall risk profile. And so I'm part of a company that we spun off, Thrive Genetics, where we are now exploring how this could be useful in clinical settings to individuals to help them in making the best choices about substance use, for example, in clinical
Mhm.
settings where opioids might be prescribed for procedures, operations, cancer treatments, et cetera. And people might want to better understand their risk going into being exposed to high doses of those drugs, or in other places like in treatment settings where individuals might want to better understand both from the clinician standpoint and the patient standpoint, like let's just to have a look at your risk profile here so that we know what are the things in your jar, right?
Yep.
What are the specific risk factors that you're carrying, and how can we then adjust your treatment and recovery plan accordingly? So those are some of the new things that are really kind of at the cutting edge that we're working to refine, that I really hope are going to be available and making, their way into clinical settings in the near future.
This is so exciting 'cause it really is taking away some of the stigma and some of the blame, of the and taking away the personal accountability, which we know there is some personal accountability, of course, in all of our decisions, but the idea too of the risk profile. And if you know that you have certain risk profiles, that I love that you expanded to the behavioral risk to gambling, gaming,
Mhm.
pornography. How can
Yes.
you be best supported? How can we then shift the environment to support and take again the onus off of the person, feeling so much that it's predestined and destiny, that their genetic makeup is bad or not good.
Yes.
That's really interesting. And I just want to go back to something you said, just to make sure our listeners get this. So, Dr. Danielle, is is there a gene for addiction? Just a gene?
There is no gene for any complex biomedical, psychiatric, or behavioral outcome. So that is definitely one of my pet peeves when you still see on TV, like, oh, they carried the gene for alcoholism or,
Uh-huh.
the gene for depression or whatever it might be. All of these really complex mental health outcomes and behaviors, um, whether they are subclinical or clinical, because even something like ADHD, well, we know impulsivity is shaped like a bell curve. And
Hmm.
parents will say to me, is this normal that my child is, behaving this way or having these problems? And I say, hey, it is normal for kids to be all across the bell curve. And so it's going to be normal for some individuals to be high on some of these traits that can elevate risk for problems, but you can also reframe it to think about, okay, what are the good things associated with that, right? How am I going to channel that in other directions? So that's what I really think, this idea of there is no gene for these outcomes. There are genes that influence the way our brains are wired, and some of those tendencies put us more at risk for certain types of things, for developing clinical challenges like ADHD, anxiety, depression, and substance use disorders. But, as we're fond of saying, your genes are not your fault and they're not your fate. So there's no gene for an
Love that.
outcome, and no one is also predestined to develop any particular outcome.
And you do a great job actually talking about if you do have a child that has more energy than you're used to managing, how do you work with them so you can both enjoy things together? And I think there are some things, well, some of them can be focused on younger kids. They can also focus on adult relationships and just recognizing both of your natural inclinations and how can we find ways to do things together. I wanted to see too, if we shift gears a little bit too, to looking at your career spanning, 20 years in research, and then some of those incredible applications you just shared that are very current and present. Can you walk us through how your thinking has evolved from basic genetic identification to that could inform prevention going forward? And is there some sort of moment in your life where that really shifted you, sort of again to bring this drive out of academia into working with universities and families?
So, when I reflect back on the 25 years or so that I have been in this field since, the time I graduated from undergrad and started on my PhD and whatnot, it is unbelievable how quickly the field has advanced. And so, the techniques and the strategies that we were using 20 years ago are absolutely obsolete today. So when my mentor talked about when he was in graduate school, so, fast forward another 20 years before me, and he raised the idea that things like personality, behavior, mental health conditions might be genetically influenced. That was considered radical and ridiculous.
Hmm.
So it really hasn't been that long that we really thought things like autism, schizophrenia, substance use problems, those were all caused in the family, right? Often
Hmm.
mothers were blamed. Mothers were blamed for a lot of things, right? It was cold mothering that
Hmm.
caused schizophrenia and autism, and it was poor parenting that caused addiction to run in families and those kinds of things. So, if you go even a little further back, if you think back in the last 4 years, we have a ways to go, but we have come a far way. When I think about the field of genetics that I work in, so early in my career, we were just quantifying how genetically influenced are these things? How important are genes? How important is the environment? Today, we're able to identify specific genes and actually create genetic risk scores for individuals. That was just unheard of or not even thought about 20 years ago. In fact, one of the things that I do sometimes when I give talks is I show a little clip from the opening scene of the movie Gattaca, which came
Hmm.
out in the mid 90s. It has Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman in it. And it's a science fiction movie. So this was around the time that I was graduating from college and starting down this field. And in this science fiction movie, They're imagining a world where you know an individual's genetic predisposition from birth. They get a lot of things wrong, and it's kind of a cautionary tale about genetic determinism. But in that opening scene, they take a drop of blood from a newborn baby, and what they're saying is 50% chance of ADHD, 30% chance of asthma, 70% chance of heart disease. And interestingly, a lot of the conditions they rattle off are mental health conditions. People have a lot of interest in these kinds of things. That was purely science fiction 20 years ago, and it is now where the science is today. The thing to consider, and the reason I think this is so important, is because I have a parallel clip taken from the same time in the mid 80s from the Today Show. And Katie Couric and the other hosts are talking about, what is the internet? Is it something you write to? Now ABC wants us to use this like at abc.com. Like, what is the internet anyway? And they're saying, oh, it's this thing that researchers and scientists are kind of talking about. And of course, when I show it now, everyone laughs because 30 years later, of course, what we have is a world where the internet has revolutionized our lives. Our kids don't know a world before they had, every bit of information they ever needed and wanted at their fingertips. What made that happen? What made that huge shift happen was exponential growth in computing technology. And our brains, which have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to think linearly, they can't wrap their head around exponential growth. Why am I going into all of this? Because genetics is the only field other than computing that has experienced exponential growth. But the exponential growth of computing started in the 60s, and the exponential growth of genetics started in the early 2000s with the mapping of the human genome. So we're 40 years behind, but think about what the last 30 years of exponential growth has meant for computing in our lives. And I say this because, so now imagine this crazy thing scientists are talking about. We can create genetic risk. We can change brainwave activity. It feels like science fiction, I'm sure, especially to the clinicians and the families that are on the ground and dealing with this. But exponential growth changes things in a way that we just can't imagine. That is also why I am very passionate about getting information out about what we are finding about genetic influences on substance use outcomes, other behavioral addictions, starting to put this out into the hands of clinicians and patients and the public to understand there is no gene for, how genetics works, because we don't do a good job of that with high school biology, right? We teach Punnett squares and blue eyes and brown eyes. We don't teach thousands of genetic variants and how they come together and how they interact with the environment. And this is where medicine is going. And this is where mental health and substance use and addiction treatment is going. And so that is one of the reasons that I am so passionate about. We need to do more to educate the public about this is coming. Here's what we have found, and really laying the groundwork for what I see as our ability to truly make a difference and finally moving the needle in addiction prevention and treatment.
Wow, and really actually get to know ourselves a lot better. I mean, that's what's so fascinating, as externalized as it can sound and comparing it to the internet, seeing external factors, but we're really actually doing a deep, deep dive and study to what's actually already inside of us and has been for generations, which is just so profound that now we can look at what we're all carrying with a more informed lens, a much more informed lens. So I think it's really exciting, and you did such a beautiful job breaking down very high level scientific concepts into how they actually affect us on the daily.
Well, that's
I
one of
want
my favorite things. Is to,
well,
yeah.
I can tell it's fun watching you light up like this. It's so exciting to see your passion because it's very palpable that you love what you do, which is such a gift to really love what you do and be able to share it with others.
It is.
Incredible. I want to ask, I am just going to read just two more questions that I wanted to get in. I wasn't sure how to weave in because we're also at Mountainside so passionate about proactive training and resourcing and prevention. So, how would you take some of the work to help comprehensive support move to universities and colleges and places where they don't have it's not that they don't have access to the research yet, but maybe they're not implementing the research yet. So how could we take like a lot of the effective work that you're finding in intervention and bring it on a broader scale to other educational settings?
So that is actually one of the things that we are working on right now. And so if you look at kind of gold standard substance use prevention programming that's implemented at many colleges and other places, that we tend to call them brief motivational interventions, and or personalized feedback interventions, where individuals are filling out some information about their substance use. They get feedback about how that might relate to their peers, and they get strategies for harm reduction in
Mhm.
terms of making decisions about their substance use. Now, it turns out that, as anyone who has ever worked with a young person knows, anytime you say something like, and today we're doing substance use prevention programming, everyone rolls their eyes. Nobody wants to do it. In universities, we have figured out these creative ways to force them to do it, like requiring them to do, required alcohol or other drug programming for these prevention programs before we'll let them register for classes or whatnot. And I think all this speaks to the fact that, young people tend to be not enthusiastic about anything that sounds like substance use prevention programming coming from adults.
Mhm.
So we've been trying to think creatively about how do we change that whole narrative?
Mhm.
The mom and me calls it chocolate covered broccoli. How do we get something that's good for someone to them in a way that they are also excited about? And so we know that kids tend to hate anything that sounds like prevention programming, but one of the things that they tend to love to do is fill out surveys and quizzes about themselves, right? You see this
Mhm.
all over social media. What dog are you like? What superhero are you most like, etc. So what we did is we actually designed a program that is not about focused on alcohol or other drugs, but is focused on learn about yourself to get the most out of your college experience. And so what we do is we have them fill out this short survey. And of course, what that survey consists of are these items that tap into the behavioral characteristics, these genetically influenced characteristics that we know can put individuals at elevated risk for substance use and mental health challenges, but don't necessarily have to, right? Not determinative, but can indicate elevated risk. You also figure they're going into a new environment, one that can be very risk
Mhm.
enhancing. And so, what we do is we essentially built this program where individuals fill out this survey. We then use gamification so they can design their own little avatar to look like them. And then they get feedback about, like, this is your unique makeup. And so we give them information about where they fall on these dimensions that we've been talking about. Things like extroversion, things like sensation seeking and
Mm.
impulsivity, things like anxiety sensitivity. And then what we do for each of these areas is we walk through the good, the not so good, and then we have kind of a level up. Here are resources to support you for your unique characteristics. And then we kind of have some activities to help them think about how the choices that they make are related to kind of the way their brains are wired and their unique makeup, and how those choices relate to what their long-term goals are and what they ultimately want out of life. So we put all this together in kind of a short, brief online format, very similar to, what is done with kind of these substance use prevention modules. And then we ran a study and we said, how do students who take this, what we call the personalized feedback program, which isn't billed as substance use
Mhm.
prevention, it's billed as learn about yourself to get the most out of your college experience. How did students who went through that program compare in terms of alcohol and other drug use? as compared to this kind of gold standard program, which is focused on substance use. Great content and information in there, but it's all harm reduction substance use content. And what we found is that actually students who took this personalized feedback program had lower rates of alcohol and cannabis use when we measured them a month out, 3 months out, than students who actually had the substance use prevention content. And we think that's, it speaks to this idea that most prevention programming isn't taking into account these things that we know are kind of underlying risk factors as to why some people are more drawn to and tend to
Hmm.
use in riskier ways that can lead to problems. And so we are actually right now, we are putting this together in a much more user-friendly dashboard, and we'll be rolling it out with all of the incoming Rutgers students this fall. But we're also building it in a way that can be easily transported to other universities and to younger school systems, so to high school systems, et cetera. And we're working with younger students and with administrators who are kind of at different, working with students at different levels to think about, how we can make this maximally useful. We would welcome involvement from others who want to be a part as we're building this out. But we're really thinking about how can we take what we're learning from the
Hmm.
research and put it into programs that meet universities, schools, where they're at in terms of making it user friendly for schools to apply, for students to take, and then having that long term impact that we want of ultimately helping people make the best choices for themselves and reduce substance use problems.
That makes so much sense. I think of one that a lot of harm reduction can feel very general due to a lot of people and not personal enough. And sort of, a few concepts of like, you are the most important person you'll ever meet. Just getting to do that work. And I think that's what attracts a lot of people to filling out those surveys is that innate desire to get to know themselves better. And then, something we say a lot in program, to thy known self be true, that once you know yourself, finding your truth and your path, I think is a bit easier.
I think I heard a lot of the scientific approach and genetics throughout, our conversation. And I was wondering where do you think spirituality fits into all of this? There's a lot in the big book that talks about it being more of a spiritual malady than anything. So I was just curious to see what your take was on.
So I can give you a research take on it, and I can give you, I guess, my personal take on it as well, too. So one of the things that we know is, well, there's religiosity and spirituality, and of course those things are sometimes correlated, but not entirely so. Um, so in terms of finding outlets, right, that are positive communities, outlets, mindsets, right, that those can be extremely powerful. And so when I think of spirituality from I think of myself as a spiritual person. When I think of like the benefits of that, I think of it in terms of this, making peace with many of the research things that I've talked about, right? Making peace
Yeah.
with and thinking about who you are, your strengths, your weaknesses, how you want to do better. And we know that one of the sections of that prevention program is actually called brain train, right? That you can actually train your brain to do things that don't come to you naturally, right? That's part of what we're doing when we're
Sure.
teaching little kids self-control, or someone who's more prone to
Yeah.
anxiety
Mm.
to like manage it. Those are
Yeah.
skills that you can develop and rewire the brain. I think of spirituality as in its best form, helping individuals, rewire the brain in those positive kinds of ways where
Mm.
you're
Uh,
embracing some of the parts that are wonderful about, mindfulness is another practice for which there's good research showing that it can be very effective. And, if you think of what are their common elements with a lot of these pieces, spirituality, yoga, mindfulness, Tai Chi, um, happened to be listening to a podcast about from a researcher who was implementing more yoga and studying outcomes. And of course, there's all this literature on how it literally like rewires the brain. So
Sure.
I guess that is my roundabout answer of the researcher in me thinks that that's probably one of the many positive ways that that operates, right? Uh, is in helping keep focused on the things that are really important, even when our brains might be giving us impulses otherwise.
Sure. No, that's great. Thank you so much. I know like suggestions that sponsors would make, like call me every day or start meditating or start, praying is something that I know for me didn't come
Mm.
naturally. And I sort of had to force myself to get into a healthy habit.
Yeah.
Right. And so that like retraining part was, I could definitely see
And
that.
and I
Yeah.
think that part of the reason it's hard to quantify is because people define it in so many different ways, and so sometimes there are positive impacts in the sense that we know that obviously having a good community, right, in terms
Mhm.
of, you
Right.
know, positive people in your life is so important in
Mhm.
terms of recovery, and so some people find that in a spiritual or a religious community. Sometimes there are, literally
Mm.
activities that it's like, I can do this instead of that, right? Sometimes there's literally prohibitions against using alcohol or having alcohol in places, so I think there's
Sure.
probably a whole series of different ways that it can be beneficial. And just in the research side of things, we also know that like if you just look in these big, huge samples where we ask people like, how religious are they with really crude sorts of measures, right? Like how much do you go to church or
Mhm.
whatnot or something. Um, it tends
Mhm.
to reduce the associations between genetic predispositions and substance use outcomes. And I think it's partly because sometimes there might be prohibitions, go to an Episcopal church, there's certainly no prohibitions there, but it's also just, I think having a community of people around you, right? That,
Sure.
being married, by the way, is another thing that actually reduces associations between genetic risk and outcomes. It's like the more people that are paying attention to you, your behavior, it sort of serves as a community monitoring kind of,
Mm.
being there
Sure.
for that person and helping interrupt what might be some of these, um, adverse paths that one might go down. So, I don't know, those
Sure.
are my kind of half-baked, admittedly, thoughts.
No, those those are great. I think there's an explanation for most things, and I think part of my recovery was taking suggestions even if I didn't understand them. You know, just sort of regaining hope by seeing other people succeed and surrounding myself with them too.
Yeah,
So
um, that's
This
wonderful.
is random too, but I'm thinking as you're sharing, Danielle, I not suggestions. It's just like not that you've ever asked for a suggestion, but if you have another book, which I'm sure you'll have another book, I think you should read it. You have a beautiful voice. I like your voice better than the woman who read your book on Audible. Read your book. You have a beautiful voice.
Um,
Have
Jen,
you heard this before?
that's so sweet of you. So when they were recording the Audible version, I had said, um, "Can I read it?" And they were like, "Sure, we do a little sound test with you, I guess, to make sure you're not monotonous or something of that." But it was, "Okay, great. We're gonna need you to mark off 2 weeks to be in the recording studio all day, every day." And, I mean, it hit me at a time where, you're talking about all the things, and, I mean, I
All
still
the
had a young
things.
son then too that I was like, "Oh, that's not gonna happen," right? Like,
sure,
so, but thank you, that's very kind, and, if or when I get myself around to writing another book, then, I'll take that under advisement.
Yeah, I was like, I can't leave without telling her that. I was like, oh, I can listen to you. You have a beautiful voice. You really do. It's really grounding and it's just your enthusiasm and your passion. It comes through so much, which is just I think, very infectious. And I think it's exciting for our listeners to know, like, they're not just a research project. Like, there's people that really, really care about
Yeah.
changing things, really care about, like, no, I want to help you. I want to help you. Because that's what I really heard underneath this whole thing is like, you want to help. You want to find ways that it doesn't have to be this hard. We know there's so many societal factors we can't change, but if we can start to change the way we see ourselves, I'm like, that's
Great.
the best gifts we could give someone. Which, yeah.
I think the guilt and shame around my previous action in addiction is still heavy as it relates to my
Well,
kids. You know what I mean? It yeah, that's a heavy burden to bear. And if there was ways for us to sort of, support people, through that, it's good. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's in these places that we think that I think really the stigma that still surrounds addiction really shows up.
Yep.
Because I've talked with like cancer survivors, right, who were pretty absent, when their children were little because they were so sick, right?
Mhm.
And they also
Sure.
have guilt over not being there and not being a part of their child's life, and that their child's early childhood was kind of consumed with their disorder, and all the ways that interrupted their normal the life they would have wanted them to have as a small child. But yet, right, like, that's a different kind of thing than I think when you talk to individuals who had substance use disorders, where it's like my behavior or the things I did while under the influence of these drugs impacted my family dynamic and unit and all those kind of things. But, on some, and yes, they're different, but on some level, this is a person who is struggling with a medical condition, something that has
Mhm.
altered their
Right.
biology, and that is impacting the family unit, right? And I
Right.
think the more that we can start to shift those narratives, hopefully, it can also help families, and individuals make peace with it and move on. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I don't suppose a cancer patient would have convinced themselves that they're just a bad
mhm,
person, right? Whereas
exactly.
somebody in recovery, that's the identity that they sort of adopt.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but cool. Thanks. Appreciate it.
So I really appreciate your time today, Danielle. I know you're incredibly busy. You are working on so many really exciting, cutting edge um, initiatives, I think, that are really going to help a lot of people, communities, and sort of change the way we see substance use disorders in our system. So thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for taking the time to come share with us on the Sober Spill.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and right back at you. Thank you for the amazing work that you all are doing on the ground. It really takes all of us, and I think it's these kinds of partnerships are the places where we're really going to be able to make an impact.
Thank you.
If you or a loved one is struggling with addiction, Mountainside can help. Call 860-365-6764 to speak with our caring treatment team.